Hey guys, this week we are reading Digging Up a Painful Past, and it's about the Tulsa Race Massacre that occurred in 1921. This is a really interesting topic because it's something that has not been a part of our historical record that we learn about in the past, and it's finally starting to come back to the surface. There is a great novel called Dreamland Burning. If you find this at all interesting, and I'll talk about that also in live class. And there is, if you've seen the HBO series Watchmen, or if you haven't seen it, it also includes this event, this historical event, in part of its history. So, I want you to look first, of course, as always, at some of the text features, the title, the subtitle, and I want you to look at the pictures that we see. These pictures are in black and white. They kind of have that old yellowish tone. And so we can tell that this obviously is in the past. In the caption right here, it shows me, it says 1921. I didn't even read the whole caption. I just went to the date, okay? But I do want you to go through these and look at the captions. I am in the presentation view because I wanted you to be able to see it all on one screen. So I'm going to begin reading right up here on the O, but I'm going to read my subtitle first. It says, 100 years after one of the worst race massacres in U.S. history, the city of Tulsa, Oklahoma is searching for victims' graves. Now, here's why I find this interesting, you guys, is it was one of the worst race crimes in America's history. And when I was in school, it was not mentioned at all. I had never heard of this until I read the book, Dreamland Burning, and I was shocked that it was something that I did not learn about. Okay, but let's start up here on May 30th, 1921. On May 30th, 1921, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma was a thriving black community, a rarity in an era of segregation, lynchings, and a rapidly growing Ku Klux Klan. By sunrise on June 2nd, however, Greenwood lay in ruins, burned to the ground by a mob of white people, aided and abetted by the Oklahoma National Guard. The death toll may have been as high as 300, with hundreds more injured and an estimated 8,000 or more left homeless. The Tulsa Race Massacre, as it came to be known, was one of the worst acts of racial violence in American history. But city officials immediately set about erasing the atrocity from the historical record. That's important because they basically did not want it to be known, and so they made sure that it wasn't mentioned. When the carnage was over, the victims were buried hastily in unmarked graves without death certificates. Police records vanished, and archival copies of some newspaper coverage of the killings were selectively expunged. Okay, so this is, to me, because I love true crime things, this is very interesting. Like, this is basically like they are like covering up murder. Schools didn't teach the massacre, and generations of people, even the descendants of some of the survivors, grew up not knowing about it. Now, a century after the massacre, the city of Tulsa is digging up its painful past, literally, in an effort to bring some reconciliation to the community. Okay, so here we are right here, guys. This is where we are right now, at this new section with the subtitle, Revisiting Black Wall Street. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but Wall Street in New York is a very affluent place where people trade stocks and bonds, but most people that are there have a lot of money. So that is what was also happening in Tulsa, but it was within the black community, and people didn't want to let that stand. Archaeologists working for the city broke ground this past summer in Tulsa's oldest cemetery to search for the graves of the massacre's victims. In October, they announced a big discovery. They had found 12 coffins and have a high degree of confidence that they may contain some of the remains that they're looking for. More work will be required to know for sure, but for Brenda Alford, whose parents survived the massacre and who is on the committee overseeing the project, the recent finding is encouraging. I'm very appreciative of all the hard work that is going into finding out our truth, she says, to again bring some sense of justice and healing to our community. At the time of the massacre, the Greenwood neighborhood had a population of nearly 10,000, including descendants of enslaved people as well as others who had come because Oklahoma seemed to offer a chance to escape the harsher racial realities of life in the Deep South. according to a 2001 investigation of the massacre. Black Tulsans segregated into Greenwood had built a thriving business town known as Black Wall Street. 30 residents owned grocery stores there in 1921, says State Senator Kevin Matthews, who represents Tulsa. There were restaurants, hotels, theaters, and transportation services run by black entrepreneurs. That's what people don't know, Matthews says. We had that kind of prosperity in 1921. This was Black Wall Street for a reason, and it was burned down and destroyed for a reason. The violence in Tulsa was a part of growing backlash among white people to the advancements being made by black Americans after slavery. Between 1877 and 1950, more than 4,000 black Americans were brutally lynched, according to the Equal Justice Initiative. The perpetrators were often aided by local officials and rarely punished in the court. Mob violence spread across the U.S. in the summer and fall of 1919 during the Great Migration, when millions of black Southerners fled to cities in the North, Midwest, and West. White soldiers had returned from World War I to find an increase in competition for jobs in factories, shipyards, and mills. At the same time, many black soldiers had returned to find that the country they had risked their life fighting for still denied them their basic freedoms through segregation and other forms of discrimination. Amid these rising tensions, white mobs incited violence in a number of major cities, including Chicago, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. So much blood was spilled that summer that it was dubbed the Red Summer. And that violence would soon come to Tulsa. We're going to be right here, guys. They took everything. The massacre in Tulsa began much like many other acts of racial violence had, with a false allegation that a black man had raped a white woman. That man was Dick Rowland, and he was accused of assaulting Sarah Page, an elevator operator, on May 30th, 1921. Nobody knows for sure what happened, but the charges against him were later quietly dropped. One theory is that Rowland may have tripped in the elevator and to catch his fall grabbed Page's arm. She screamed, and he ran from the building, knowing the danger he was in for touching a white woman. Rowland was arrested the next morning and jailed in the Tulsa County Courthouse, where the sheriff had allowed a lynch mob to kidnap another black man the year before. So when the Tulsa Tribune ran an inflammatory article and editorial on May 31st, black Tulsans had every reason to fear that Rowland would be lynched and no reason to believe the authorities would protect him. That evening, as hundreds of white Tulsans shouted for the sheriff to turn Rowland over, groups of armed black men showed up at the courthouse and told officials they were there to help defend it. Many white people went off to get their own weapons, and the crowd grew to more than 2,000. Finally, a white man tried to grab a black man's gun, and the gun went off. And the white mob spread out through the streets of downtown Tulsa, shooting black people on sight. The morning of June 1st, the mob rushed into Greenwood and opened fire. They led black people out of their homes, businesses at gunpoint, looted valuables, and set buildings on fire. Black residents tried to defend themselves, but were overpowered. We're right here, guys. The mob stopped firefighters from reaching much of the burning neighborhood, while the police and Oklahoma National Guard, sent in earlier that morning by the governor, arrested black people instead of the white rioters. And in some cases, members of the National Guard joined the rioters. Olivia Hooker was 6 years old at the time. She survived by hiding with her mother and her siblings under a dining room table as a mob invaded her home. She recalled the experience in an interview with the Washington Post before she died in 2018 at the age of 103. They took everything they thought was valuable, she said. They smashed everything they couldn't take. She added, I was a child who didn't know about bias and prejudice. It was quite a trauma to find out people hated you for your color. It took me a long time to get over my nightmares. Soon after the massacre, the Ku Klux Klan used the mob violence as a recruiting tool, and within months its Tulsa chapter became one of the nation's largest. Although some black Tulsans, including Rowland, fled the city after the massacre, numerous black communities marshaled their money and resources to help Greenwood rebuild. But city officials spent the next 50 years pretending nothing had happened. What happens fairly rapidly is this culture of silence descends, says Scott Ellsworth, whose 1980 book, Death in a Promised Land, was the first full history of the massacre, and the story of the riot becomes actively suppressed. Now I want to stop right there, and this is where we are. I want to stop right there because this is important, that when they say this story was suppressed, that means that they really did not encourage and in fact discouraged it being taught in schools and for it to get out, because it is shameful, and that shows that they knew that this situation was wrong and it shouldn't, and it was just appalling, and they hid it, much like the Nazis tried to hide what they were doing to the Jews. Seeking the truth. In the new effort to bring the massacre to the surface is taking place amid a nationwide reckoning with racism, sparked by the protests over the killings of George Floyd and Black Americans. In 2019, experts began identifying areas of Tulsa's Oak Lawn Cemetery where records and research suggested victims' remains might be found. Then they used ground-penetrating radar to search for evidence of burials. Excavation crews broke ground at one site this past summer but came up empty. So they turned their attention to another area of the cemetery in October. And that's when, after 4 days of digging, they found the 12 unmarked coffins with human remains. All Tulsans deserve to know what happened. It will take more painstaking work to bring up the remains without damaging them, so they can be fully analyzed to determine whether they are in fact victims of the massacre. The city plans to do so later this year when weather permits. Many Black Tulsans hope the renewed attention to the massacre leads to more concrete actions to address the racial injustices that persist today. But many people also see the dig for the victims' graves as a necessary step in that direction. For Tulsa Mayor G.T. Bynum, moving forward requires an honest reckoning with the past. All Tulsans deserve to know what happened in 1921, especially descendants of victims, Bynum wrote when he announced the project in 2018. The only way to move forward in our work to bring about reconciliation in Tulsa is by seeking the truth honestly. Okay, now I want you to look at this little part right here. This is like an infographic, an info box. And I'm going to zoom in. And we're going to, oh, I didn't mean to highlight all that, you guys. Oh, let's take that out. Okay, doesn't matter. I just want it to get in the picture. There we go. Okay, healing old wounds. A look at other cities trying to make amends for past incidences of racial violence. Now, this is important, guys, because in the past, let's be clear. Who wrote the history books? White people. And if you're writing the history books, you have the luxury to leave out the bad stuff if you want to. And that is a lot of what happened over time with the history of violence against African Americans. And that is completely wrong. It's not a full picture of what was going on. And so let's look at what's going on in some other cities. Since the killing of George Floyd in May, some cities have sought to atone for past racial violence by issuing formal apologies. While many Black activists have applauded these actions, they're also pushing for more changes to address the racial inequalities that persist. The apologies are important, says historian Hassan Kwame Jeffries. But he adds, to be meaningful, they have to mark the start of a process of addressing systemic racism, not the end. Birmingham, Alabama. And I think y'all, if you're in Mr. Taylor's English class, you probably heard about this or read about this. 1963 church bombing. One of the most infamous acts of racial violence took place in 1963 when members of the Ku Klux Klan bombed the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The bombing killed 4 young girls and injured several others. In September, Alabama Governor Kay Ivey apologized to a survivor, Sarah Collins Rudolph, after she requested an apology from the state. The bombing had left Rudolph, who was 12 at the time, blind in one eye and killed her sister. That day changed the course of my life forever, Rudolph says. Greensboro, North Carolina. In 1979, Greensboro Massacre. Members of the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis opened fire on marchers at an anti-Klan rally in Greensboro in 1979. 5 people were killed and several others were wounded. In October, the city council issued a formal apology for the incident, noting that the police had failed to prevent the violence. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1985, MOVE bombing. But see how that's all capitalized? It probably stands for something, M-O-V-E. In November, Philadelphia City Council officially apologized for the police department's decision in 1985 to drop a bomb on a row house, killing 11 residents and igniting a fire that destroyed dozens of homes in a black neighborhood. Police have been trying to clear out MOVE, a black liberation group that the city officials deemed a violence-threatening cult, from a row house. After the police helicopter dropped an improvised bomb on the home, the police ordered firefighters to let the fire burn. So even though this is painful, guys, and awkward in some cases, it's important that we talk about these things that are in our past and acknowledge what happened, because if we act like it never happened, we can't go forward with change, okay? Acting like something doesn't exist does not make it go away. But learning about it helps us to not repeat those same mistakes. Okay, so we will talk about this a lot in class. Bye.